Welcome to PHI, Public Health Impact. I'm Phaedra Corso.
And I'm Cham Dallas. In today's episode, we're going to look at something that affects all of us, food, and in particular, food safety.
Cham, I'll be talking to Dr. Mary Alice Smith, and she's a developmental toxicologist in one of our departments here in the College of Public Health, Environmental Health Sciences.
You know, we think of food as usually the content of food, the nutrient value, like the obesity epidemic, which we've covered in another one of our episodes. But really, food safety is a whole nother issue that affects all of us.
And what I like about this episode, Cham, in particular, is that we're talking about bench science today. And that's a part of public health most people don't even know we do.
Yeah, and we just take it for granted that the food is good to eat. But as we're going to see in today's episode, sometimes that is not the case.
With me now is Dr. Mary Alice Smith. She's an associate professor in the Department of Environmental Health Sciences. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
And Mary Alice, you're a developmental toxicologist. That is a term I'm sure many of our viewers haven't heard before. So before we start, why don't you tell us what that is?
Well, let me start by saying the toxicologist is a person who studies poisons. And a developmental toxicologist is a person who studies chemicals or pathogens that adversely affect pregnancy and development.
Okay, and how did you get interested in this field? It seems a very narrow but interesting field, so how did you get interested?
Well, I got a degree in biology, and I became more and more interested in how babies develop or how pregnancy goes to full term and what kinds of chemicals or pathogens might adversely affect those. So it was really looking at what things make pregnancies go wrong and what can be done to prevent that. That's what really got me interested in it.
Okay, and what kind of research are you doing right now?
Well, I'm looking at both pathogens and chemicals that affect pregnancy. I work with Listeria Monocytogenes, which we will talk about later on, and I also work with some chemicals that adversely affect pregnancy or that we think do.
So let's talk about one of these pathogens specifically. So listeriosis, tell me about that exactly.
Well, listeriosis is a disease that's caused by the foodborne pathogen Listeria Monocytogenes. And so if a pregnant woman consumes Listeria Monocytogenes in food, she has a high risk of having a stillbirth or a miscarriage. So it's kind of an interesting disease because it doesn't really adversely affect her usually, but it can be devastating and life-threatening to her unborn child.
And are there other parts of the population that are affected by listeriosis?
Yes, so older people can be affected by listeriosis, and they're one of the susceptible groups. Most people who are between the ages of 2 or 3 and 65 are resistant, and if they get exposed to it, they might have diarrhea or some other typical foodborne symptoms.
How would someone like me, or in contrast, what would the symptoms be for a pregnant woman? So how do those compare for the general population?
For the pregnant woman, this is one of the difficulties of learning about and preventing this disease, because the pregnant women usually don't have any kind of specific symptoms. They report sometimes flu-like symptoms, but it's not all that uncommon for any of us to have flu. So the pregnant woman usually doesn't think about this is something that could be threatening my unborn child.
And is it the case that if the pregnant woman goes to see her obstetrician because she's experiencing flu-like symptoms, that they would even know to look at listeriosis as a possible cause?
Well, I think there's a lot more awareness now than there were, say, 20 years ago for listeriosis. So if the woman presents with flu-like symptoms, the obstetrician might check her, but again, not necessarily, because it's not very uncommon for a pregnant woman to get the flu. It's fairly uncommon for her to get listeriosis.
And what about the rest of the general population? Do they experience the same kind of symptoms?
If they have really high exposure, in other words, if they get exposed to a large number of Listeria monocytogenes, then they may have, again, diarrhea, sort of the typical gastrointestinal symptoms. But in general, they're not nearly as susceptible as the pregnant women, elderly, and I should mention also immunocompromised.
Okay, and can the pathogen be so severe in the human body that it causes death?
Yes, it can. So if you're in one of the susceptible groups, older people, immunocompromised people, then it can cause meningitis and death. But again, in pregnant women, it's usually not life-threatening to them. It's usually their unborn child.
And what kinds of foods are harboring these pathogens?
Well, this is very interesting because we've had outbreaks from many different kinds of food with listeriosis. And so the most recent one was this past fall in cantaloupes. But typically it's foods like soft cheeses, and it's foods that might be made from unpasteurized milk. And so that's certainly one of the problems and considerations in terms of drinking unpasteurized milk. It puts you at very high risk.
Well, I'd like to hear a little bit more about the cantaloupe outbreak. Was it here in Georgia? Was it nationally? What was going on with that?
The cantaloupe outbreak started in the West, started in Colorado, and spread to 28 states. Fortunately, Georgia was not involved. We did not have a case of it, but Alabama did. So it spread pretty much throughout the United States. There were over 100 cases of listeriosis and over 30 deaths, according to CDC. So it was in their terms, the worst foodborne outbreak, the deadliest foodborne outbreak in over 90 years.
Wow. And what are ways that we can prevent exposure?
Well, the main thing is when you're preparing food to make sure you prepare it under very sanitary conditions. Take all the normal precautions. Wash up and keep the kitchen very clean. Wash your hands very often. Make sure you don't cross-contaminate things like meat with vegetables that might be eaten raw. So those are the kinds of things that you can do in your kitchen to prevent listeriosis. One of the problems with this particular bacteria is that it can grow at refrigerator temperatures. So normally we put things in the refrigerator to prevent pathogens from growing, but in this case, listeria can grow in the refrigerator, and so just putting it there doesn't mean the food's going to be okay. So for one thing, you shouldn't eat food that's been in the refrigerator for too many days, particularly if you're in these high-risk groups.
I'd love to know what the typical day in your lab looks like, because this is such an interesting area and it's kind of out of the realm of some of the other shows that we've done on public health where we're in the communities and talking to people. You're really kind of the bench science part of public health.
Right.
So tell me about what your day looks like.
Well, so my day is very different from day to day. I never know quite how the day is going to go when I come into work, which is part of the fun of it. But I teach, so I do teach classes that are in developmental toxicology, and I teach a course in environmental risk assessment, and also one in environmental toxicology. But around those classes, I do research, and I have graduate students, and those students do a lot of the hands-on research in the lab. So I train those students, and then they carry out these experiments. So we look at developing models for listeriosis. One of the things that has really held back progress on listeriosis is we didn't have a good animal model that we could use to test things on. So one of the first things I did when I started working on it was say, how can we develop a good animal model?
And so when you use this term animal model, is it the idea that we look at how these pathogens work through certain animals and then make some assumptions on how this might be working in humans, since we can't test on humans?
Yes, yeah, that's exactly right. And in fact, we try to get an animal model that's as close to humans as we can. So I started out working in primates and with some of my colleagues at Yerkes National Primate Center in Atlanta. And then because primates are very expensive and we'd rather not do too many invasive things with primates, we moved to a smaller animal model, and that was guinea pigs. Now we're working with gerbils because gerbils have been proposed as being a better model for humans than guinea pigs. And so there are people at the Pasteur Institute in France who've suggested this, and we're trying to test that out.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about your international collaborations, because I would imagine that there aren't a whole lot of people in the world who are doing this very specified or specific research. So what kind of collaborations do you have?
Well, I work with people here at the University of Georgia who are in the Center for Food Safety, Dr. Mike Doyle and Dr. Joe Frank, and they have been the the food scientists that's worked with me. I've also worked with people, as I mentioned, at Yerkes Primate Center. And I'm hoping to get a collaboration with one of my colleagues in France at the Pasteur Institute. He visited last summer, and we're working on doing some more work in primates with that group. So it is an international problem. In fact, in some countries, they allow unpasteurized milk to be used to make cheese, like France.
Right.
And so they have a bit more of a problem with it than we do in the United States, because we do not allow that.
So I have one more question for you, which is, how do we take this bench science from the work that you're doing with the animals and translate it into the communities to prevent people being exposed? So kind of take me through what that path looks like.
Okay. So one of the things we do is we work with people at CDC also. CDC can give us the strains of Listeria that are found in the outbreaks. So we actually can get this same kind of Listeria that cause the outbreaks in humans, and we can test those in our animal models. We also can test some of the Listeria in vitro. So we don't just use animal models, we also use test tube. That's kind of literally what we mean by in vitro. We use test tube tests so that we can try to learn specifically, very specific ideas of how Listeria crosses a cell membrane. And so that's been really helpful in learning more about it. And then what we'd like to do to take it a step further and then make it really applicable to people is we'd like to find ways to prevent it. So we're right now looking at some ways that we can prevent Listeria from crossing those cell membranes. And if we can do that, then certainly that will be a big step forward towards preventing listeriosis. We can make recommendations for what people perhaps can eat with these high-risk foods that might protect them.
Great. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
With me now is Kwaku Agyekum. He is one of Dr. Mary Alice Smith's doctoral students, fourth year PhD in toxicology.
Yeah.
How did you get interested in the field of toxicology?
Well, I met Dr. Smith when I was an undergrad here at UGA, and at that time she had some research. So I worked with her during my junior and senior year during the summer. It really piqued my interest, and I loved the public health impact of the bench work that we were doing. And so she had funds available, and we sat down and came up with a project for me. And so I got my master's with her.
In toxicology?
In toxicology, sure. And then I went off to apply my education, and I started working in the lab in a few reproductive toxicology labs, and then I came back for a PhD.
Okay, and what kind of research are you doing right now?
Dr. Smith talked about the in vitro and test tube testing of certain of Listeria Monocytogenes, and so that's part of my dissertation and my doctoral research is doing some of the in vitro tests behind trying to find the effects of Listeria Monocytogenes.
So what is your research hypothesis?
Well, she also...
Not to put you on the spot.
Right. She also talked about the probiotic work that we're doing and trying to prevent or reduce the infection of Listeria Monocytogenes. So I'm working on that probiotic portion of it, and the hypothesis is that the probiotics can provide some protection to Listeria Monocytogenes.
So I don't think I know what you mean when you say the term probiotic. What does that mean?
Right, a probiotic is the good bacteria within our body that can help us fight bacterial infections.
The probiotic work sounds very interesting. Have you presented any of your results?
I have. Most recently I presented at the Teratology Society meeting in San Diego, and I was fortunate enough to win best poster.
You know, you're the second PhD in toxicology student that we've talked to recently on this show who's then gone on to do a postdoc. I'm just curious, why do a postdoc? When you finish a PhD, why not just go out into the world and start working? What advantages are there?
Right. Some of the advantages of a postdoc are it trains you to become your own principal investigator. You know, you start to think independently, and you write more papers, scientific papers for publication, and start to establish yourself as an independent researcher.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and good luck to you in your future.
Thank you.
With me now is Rebecca Roulo. She is a first-year Master's in Environmental Health student working with Dr. Smith. Thank you so much for joining us, Rebecca.
Thanks for having me.
So I would like to hear from you how you became interested in environmental health.
Well, I actually did my undergraduate here at UGA, also environmental health. I guess I figured out in high school that it's just a broad area with so many things that you can go into that I thought it would be a good place for me to start, and I was really interested in sort of the hard science and research. And so I started my undergrad here, and I was introduced to all these different areas, and as I got older and more in depth in the program, I realized that I was starting to gravitate more towards the toxicology aspect as my area of interest. And so by the time I graduated, I knew I wanted to go to graduate school, and so as I was looking at places where they had good toxicology programs, they had research that I was interested in, and I guess I just eventually decided that UGA was still the best place, and I was especially interested in what Dr. Smith was doing, and I just thought it would be a good fit, and I really liked the research that was being done here.
Great, and so tell me, what kind of research are you doing right now working with Dr. Smith?
Well, she had mentioned that we are developing an animal model using gerbils, and I am working on that project currently.
Okay, and are you able to present your results? I mean, you're only in your second semester in your master's program, but are you already starting to get results that you can take out into the world?
We are getting some results so far. In fact, I hope to present it at the upcoming annual Teratology Society meeting.
I know it's probably early because you've got a ways to go in your master's program, but do you have any ideas on what you might want to do in the future?
Definitely some form of research. I probably won't go on immediately to a PhD, but I maybe will eventually. So I could definitely see myself working for the government, maybe CDC or EPA in the future.
Great. Well, thanks for joining us, and I wish you the best of luck.
Thank you.
We spent quite a bit of time with Mary Alice Smith and her research team talking about listeriosis. So now we're going to move and talk to Dr. Michael Doyle, who is the Regents Professor of Food Microbiology and the Director of the Center for Food Safety in Griffin, Georgia. Dr. Doyle, thank you for joining us today by Skype. We appreciate your time.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
I don't know how many of our viewers know that University of Georgia has campuses in many parts of the state. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your center and where you're located and why?
Well, our center is focused in Griffin, Georgia, which is a branch of the University of Georgia. You can get a degree here as an undergraduate, just like you get a degree in Athens. But originally, this particular campus was developed as an experiment station, an agricultural experiment station that was designed to do research on a variety of different agriculture-related topics. Everything from agriculture economics to soil to agronomy to food safety.
And how large of a center do you operate down there?
We have about 20 faculty members, of which 8 are located here in Griffin and the rest are located in Athens. A variety of graduate students and postdoctoral students as well.
So why don't you tell me a little bit about the areas of food safety that your center has been involved in most recently?
Well, our mission is largely focused on developing better ways to detect and control and eliminate harmful microbes. And my group was one of the first to develop a method to detect Ecoli 0157 in foods. And as a result of that, we work closely with the Centers for Disease Control in helping them test foods for E. coli and outbreak-related samples.
And how common is it for us to have an E. coli outbreak here in the state of Georgia? Do we see them every year, or it seems like we hear about them in the news all the time, but I just wanted to know how Georgia does when it comes to those types of outbreaks.
Well, Georgia has had outbreaks in the past. We had an E. coli outbreak associated with a water park in North Atlanta a few years back as an example. But many of the outbreaks with E. coli specifically are associated with meats, in particular beef.
So what are some ways that, that as consumers we can protect ourselves against E. coli, especially around the meats, as you said?
The easiest way is to make sure that the hamburgers you cook are cooked to at least 160 degrees. And to do that, you frequently need to have a thermometer to assure that. As an alternate, you might look at the color, but that's not always 100% reliable.
And this just reminds me, my husband likes to order his steaks blue, if you will, and I know that we don't have laws in Georgia that prevent us from ordering rare steak. Is that right? In
Georgia, I believe hamburger has requirements, but I'm not sure about steak. But steak frequently is free of E. coli in the inside. That's the part that would be medium rare or rare. The outside surface is where you usually find the harmful bacteria like E. coli. And so if that's cooked properly on the outside, then steak typically would be safe.
So let me switch gears here and just ask you, what is a typical day like for you in the Center for Food Safety?
A typical day involves a lot of paperwork. As a director, I do have an administrative role, but I also get a lot of inquiries, not just from CDC or USDA or FDA, but from the food industry as a whole. And it's not just here in the state of Georgia, but it's more national in scope. We work with a lot of companies in food service, typically work with McDonald's and Yum Brands, which owns Taco Bell and Pizza Hut and KFC. And we work a lot with retailers like Publix. We work a lot with food processors. And it's a lot of food processors, not just in Georgia, but outside the state, General Mills, Kraft, a lot of the big company names that you've heard of.
So is your role as the center to help these companies have safer food handling practices? In part. My concept is if we're going to eat food, we're going to largely eat food that comes from these major processors. And we want to help these major processors produce the safest foods possible so that we as consumers can have safe foods. What do you find to be the most challenging aspect of your job?
Most challenging is when I get a call from CDC or a company saying, oh, we've got an outbreak, we're going to have to investigate, and we have to identify what the source is, and then once we've identified source, try to identify the actual root cause within a company as to what went wrong and prevent this from happening in the future.
So alternatively, what is the most rewarding aspect of your job?
Well, what's most rewarding for me is to see how our center has helped not just the federal agencies and the companies produce safer foods, but to have these foods safer for everybody, for all consumers that are out there. And when we can say that we, our faculty and students and staff, have had an impact on producing the safest food supply in the world, that means a lot to me.
Yeah, I agree. My last question for you is, there's probably many viewers and also our students who want to have a career in the food safety industry or in research. What kind of education does one need in order to be a part of your center, for example?
Well, you can get a degree in different disciplines, but food science is one good example that will give you a strong background in how foods are processed and produced, as well as the types of problems that can go wrong in producing foods, the food safety type problems, microbiological and chemical. And quite frankly, this area of food safety is one that's going to be continuing to grow, in large part because our agriculture is shifting to other parts of the world,
right? And
we're importing more and more foods, and so the challenges relative to ensuring the safety of our food just continue to get greater. So
it's global.
This is a career that one has security.
Absolutely. Well, Dr. Doyle, thank you so much for your time today, and And we look forward to you being on the front lines of stopping any epidemics that are occurring here in the state. So thank you.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you for staying with us, and a big thank you to our guests today for this important show on food safety.
Yeah, we saw it today. We just can't take food safety for granted. We have to really take an active role to ensure that what we're eating isn't going to hurt us.
I was most interested in what Dr. Smith had to say about the foods that pregnant women should avoid, because those guidelines have completely changed since I was pregnant many, many years ago.
And there's the whole immunocompromised population of people. They're at great risk, and there has to be some special precautions taken for them.
Yeah, a lot of those concrete things we can do are the common sense things. Make sure you wash your hands before you touch your food. Make sure that the raw vegetables stay separate from the raw meat.
And the newest issue that's really kind of come back and is really hot right now, the unpasteurized milk and cheese, which is not only a public health, but has become something of a legal issue as well.
So thank you again, and we'll see you next time on PHI Public Health Impact.